Hey everyone and welcome back. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for today's explainer because we are diving into one of the most legendary, sprawling, and frankly complex lives in all of human history. We're talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. Okay, let's just get right into this. We're looking at a guy who rose from total obscurity to conquer an entire continent, completely rewrite the laws of Europe, and then spectacularly lose it all. His life is literally like a Greek tragedy slammed into a modern political thriller.
But before we get into all the grand battles and the imperial crowns, we kind of have to address the notoriously tiny elephant in the room. Was Napoleon really just a short, angry tyrant? Because for over 2 centuries, that infamous Napoleon complex, the idea that a super aggressive guy is just overcompensating for being short, has been directly tied to his name. But we have to ask, is that based on actual historical fact, or is it just incredibly effective centuries-old British propaganda?
Well, it turns out there is a massive difference between the myth and the reality here. We've all seen the British press caricatures of Little Boney or heard the nursery rhymes about the bogeyman, this tiny, bad-tempered guy constantly throwing a tantrum. But reality paints a completely different picture. Napoleon was actually about 168 centimeters tall, so around 5'6", and for his era, that was a perfectly average height. His towering ambition wasn't some kind of physical overcompensation, it was rooted in something much deeper, a brilliant, relentless drive that we're going to unpack today.
So, to make sense of this massive historical footprint, here is our roadmap. We're going to cover 1. The rise of an outsider. 2. Emperor and reformer. 3. The master of war. 4. The Russian catastrophe. And finally, 5. Exile and legacy. We're going to trace this epic narrative arc right from his meteoric rise all the way to his catastrophic ruin.
Let's start right at the beginning. Part 1, Rise of an Outsider. From Corsica to the consulate.
See, Napoleon wasn't born into the elite circles of the French mainland. He was actually born on the island of Corsica. He started out as this mocked, kind of melancholic kid with a really heavy accent, but the absolute chaos of the French Revolution ended up becoming the perfect ladder for his unique skill set. Just look at how incredibly fast this builds. In just 6 short years, his ascent is mind-blowing. In 1793, his artillery tactics break the siege of Toulon, making him a brigadier general at just 24. Then in 1795, during the 13 Vendémiaire uprising, he literally saves the French government from royalist rebels by firing cannons straight into the Paris streets. That's the famous whiff of grape shot. That move gets him command of the Army of Italy, where his 1796 campaign just totally dismantles the Austrians. He follows that up with a really audacious expedition to Egypt in 1798 and returns to France as a massive national hero. Meanwhile, the current government is weak, bankrupt, and super unpopular. So by the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, Napoleon is perfectly positioned to step in and seize power as first consul. He basically becomes the undisputed ruler of France before he even hits 31.
Which brings us to Part 2, Emperor and Reformer, the Napoleonic Code.
By 1804, just being first consul wasn't enough anymore. Napoleon famously crowns himself emperor in Notre Dame, and he actually takes the crown straight from the Pope's hands to place it on his own head. Talk about a power move. But his ambition wasn't just on the battlefield, it was administrative too. His domestic policies were sweeping, but also hugely contradictory. On one hand, you have these massive enlightened modernizations. He entrenches equality before the law for men, secures property rights, and introduces religious toleration, including emancipating Jewish and Protestant communities. He even standardizes the metric system and builds a modern public education system. But on the flip side, his reforms contain some really harsh authoritarian regressions. The code severely restricted the civil rights of women and children, making women legally subservient to their husbands. And most tragically, in 1802, he reverses the revolution's abolition of slavery, violently reinstating it in the French colonies. It's a really complex legacy, spreading modern rights while simultaneously crushing others.
Now, let's accelerate the pacing a bit. Part 3, The Master of War, Expanding the Empire.
While he was busy rewriting laws at home, he was completely revolutionizing warfare abroad. With his Grande Armée, he shifted the entire military focus from just outmaneuvering the enemy to rapidly destroying their armies, famously shattering huge European coalitions at battles like Austerlitz. And the sheer scale of the empire he built from this was unbelievable. He wasn't just expanding France's direct borders. Napoleon was super pragmatic about using nepotism to control the continent. He named himself King of Italy, he put his younger brother Louis on the throne of Holland, and installed his older brother Joseph as the King of Spain. At the absolute peak of his power, Napoleon is ruling about 40% of the entire European population either directly or indirectly. He was basically redrawing the map of Europe as a family business.
And his impact went fully global, all to the tune of $15 million. Back in 1803, Napoleon realized he couldn't easily defend his North American territories against the British. Plus, he desperately needed cash to fund his upcoming wars in Europe. So what does he do? He sells the massive Louisiana territory to the United States for a mere $15 million. That one single transaction basically doubled the size of the young United States and entirely funded the creation of the French Empire. Why this matters for us is that Napoleon's decisions were literally reshaping the modern world, far, far beyond the borders of Europe.
But, as history constantly reminds us, towering ambition often leads to hubris. Part 4. The Russian Catastrophe. The Fatal Overreach.
By 1812, Napoleon is incredibly frustrated that Russia refuses to comply with his trade embargo against Britain. So he makes a devastating choice. He invades. He marches this massive multinational army of roughly 450,000 men straight into Russia. But the Russians refuse to give him the decisive battle he wants. Instead, they just keep retreating, burning their own crops and villages in a brutal scorched earth policy. By the time Napoleon finally reaches Moscow, it's deserted and literally on fire. It's too late. The infamous Russian winter sets in, and the retreat becomes an absolute nightmare. Roughly 375,000 men are lost. They fall to attrition, starvation, disease, and the brutal freezing cold. Only around 75,000 shattered survivors manage to drag themselves across the Niemen River back into Allied territory. It goes down as one of the most disastrous military campaigns in human history.
And the domino effect from that Russian disaster is immediate. Sensing blood in the water, a newly emboldened coalition of European powers decisively defeats a much weaker Napoleon at Leipzig in 1813. By 1814, those coalition forces march all the way to the capital and actually capture Paris. Forced to surrender by his own generals, he abdicates. He's exiled to Elba, the small Mediterranean island, where they let him rule over its 12,000 inhabitants. Honestly, talk about a humiliating demotion for the guy who just used to be the master of Europe.
But come on, we know the story doesn't end there. Welcome to the cinematic final act. Part 5, Exile and Legacy. The 100 Days to St. Helena.
Deeply bored on Elba and totally separated from his family, Napoleon orchestrates this incredibly daring escape. He sails back to France with just 1,000 men, literally wins over the French armies that are sent to arrest him, and marches into Paris without firing a single shot. This kicks off his brief, totally audacious return to power, known as the 100 Days. But the powers of Europe are having none of it. They immediately declare him an outlaw and mobilize their armies. On June 18, 1815, in a desperate battle in Belgium at Waterloo, Napoleon is finally, ultimately defeated by combined British and Prussian forces. There's zero coming back from this one. He is forced to abdicate a second time, and the British take absolutely no chances. They exile him to St. Helena, a damp, windswept, super isolated rock, sitting right in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, guarded by thousands of troops and constant warship patrols.
He ends up spending his final years stuck there, dictating his memoirs and basically cementing his own legend, while his health slowly deteriorates from what modern science now confirms was stomach cancer. He dies in 1821 at just 51 years old. His reported dying words: France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Joséphine. They just perfectly capture the two massive obsessions that drove his entire existence: an unyielding thirst for military glory and a really profound romantic longing.
So what are we supposed to make of this immense, crazy life today? We really have to weigh two completely warring historical views here. On one hand, you have the enlightened despot. Through all his conquests, Napoleon spread the core ideals of the French Revolution: equality before the law, the total abolition of feudalism, the metric system, and civil codes that actually still form the basis of global law today. But we have to impartially weigh that against the megalomaniac. His relentless, unending ambition led to wars that cost an estimated 6 million lives. We're talking widespread authoritarian censorship, violently repressed uprisings, the rolling back of civil rights, and the systematic plundering of Europe's art just to fill up the Louvre in Paris.
And so, I want to leave you with this final, really provocative question. Was Napoleon the grand architect of modern Europe, or was he its first modern tyrant? Is it actually possible for one person to be the greatest champion of progress while simultaneously being its most ruthless conqueror? I want you to really think about how power shapes a person's legacy, because that's the beauty of this explainer, right? The sources give us the raw facts, but the final verdict on the man, that is entirely up to you. Keep learning, keep questioning everything, and I'll see you in the next explainer.